What's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new year, a brand new episode of the BREWtally Speaking podcast, formerly John's Entitled Podcast. I am your host, John, and with me, as always, is Daniel Terry. How are you doing this pre-New Year's Eve?
Oh, I'm doing great, man. I just got done recording a really big episode for my other podcast, and now I'm recording an equally big episode for this podcast. For a lot of you guys listening, you know, might be your first exposure to BREWtally Speaking. And for that, we are really happy to have you guys here. We ran a pretty cool campaign last week to rebrand the podcast. And so anybody that's listening, we're like really stoked that you guys are here. And hopefully we will be entertaining to you as the official podcast of MetalNexus.net. So if you're signed in for that, you know, we're going to do our best for you guys.
That is right. We are the official podcast of MetalNexus.net, where you can go and get all of your interviews, reviews, music news, and so forth. So head on over to Metal Nexus and check out all of the going-ons over there. And something that Dan and I had kind of talked about, we have a handful of guests that are kind of in limbo at this point as to coming on the podcast. Unfortunately, this is the time of year where the industry kind of shuts down until, you know, the holidays are over. But we kind of thought it would be a good opportunity with that rebrand that Dan was talking about to take advantage of all of the new people who probably had never heard of the podcast previously, hadn't really listened to any of the episodes that we had done. And I have noticed in the last week or so of the rebrand of a lot of people coming on to the Facebook page and so forth, I am noticing a pretty big spike in back episodes. So Dan and I thought this would be a really great opportunity to look at our year as the podcast and kind of go over a top 10 list of the biggest episodes as far as downloads and maybe the stories that they, you know, were made from those. And I think that also will give everyone kind of an easy cherry picking, like, I'll go listen to those 10 episodes and kind of get an idea of what the podcast was about. And maybe you'll have heard some of the stories or content that was spurned from those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully you guys grab something out of it. If not, we're going to do better. It's only going to get better from here on out. Not that it was bad before.
It was mediocre before.
Nah, you're selling yourself short.
Yeah. So I'm just going to, you know, I do have a list literally from top to bottom, but I think it'll be kind of fun just to go out of order, just because there were some of these that, you know, were predating Dan by a little bit. Definitely some that Dan kind of was on board for. So I'm going to start with one that was basically the catalyst for Dan coming on to be a co-host on the podcast, was the Hopes Fall episode with Adam Morgan. That did really well, surprisingly. There was not really any hype around it. It was basically, I think Arbiter had been announced that it was coming out, but I don't think there was like any music really off of it, and there wasn't really a whole lot known as to what was going to be going on with the band.
I think H.A. Wallace Space Academy was out.
Okay.
I think that was the only single that was released.
We couldn't even get an advance copy of that record because we tried.
No, we tried really hard. I was like, dude, just send me the test press.
Yeah.
Just send it to me. And then John's like, no, send it to me. And I'm like, no. Send it to me. Clearly I'm the guy. But you know, we didn't get that. So you know, we'll keep pestering, and you know, maybe we'll get that someday.
Yeah, that was a really fun one though. That was one where I knew, you know, Adam being a big vinyl collector, I really wanted to have him on and talk to him. And truth be told, and I think I even talked about it quite a bit in the episode, but I didn't know he was in Hopes Fall. I didn't know he was in a band. I didn't know anything about him, really. I just knew he had like all this sweet vinyl, and he was a big-time vinyl collector and pretty big in the Instagram vinyl collecting community. And we had been online friends for a little while, and then it just kind of was like this thing where, well, I want to talk to you about vinyl, and then, well, why not kind of take a deep dive on Hopes Fall? And if anyone has ever listened to Discography Discussion, other than Zayo, I would say Hopes Fall is probably Dan's, like, other big band that he gushes over all the time.
Yeah, man, I really loved Hope's Fall and really enjoyed doing that interview because I really wasn't like part of the show yet. John and I were just friends through our mutual podcasts, and it was a really fun opportunity to kind of be like, well, I could interview somebody and really do like an in-depth like Q&A type of thing. And Adam was generous enough to give us a lot of his time.
Yes.
For that interview, because I mean, a lot of our interviews are a little bit shorter. Musicians have a lot of stuff on their plate and they have a lot going on. But Adam was kind enough to spend his evening with us, and we had a few beers and we had a great conversation. And he answered a lot of questions that I had always had about the band. Even being a super fan, there were things that I didn't know or didn't really have his perspective on them. So yeah, that's a really good pick, John. It's definitely one of my favorites. Not just for the superficial reason of like it was the first episode I was on, but it definitely was like my resume for where I'm at now.
It was a really good one, and that was definitely one where I kind of let Dan take the reins, and it was a really good one, and one that really kind of I think helped give us, like we said, a good feeling out for each other. We worked really well, and obviously I think that just kind of spoke to the ease of bringing you in and really kind of making me like, well, I guess this is how good this could be, which is having someone else to bounce the intros and so forth off of and all of that. So kind of moving along to another interesting one. Some of these, the stories that happen from them, or just the interview itself. A lot of these, and honestly, the podcast as a whole, and I hope it really does continue into the new year, and I don't see why it wouldn't, is just the unexpected nature that happens from these interviews. And I'm going to go to the Chariot episode with Keller Harbin from Holy Gold. And
oh yeah,
that was another one where I honestly didn't really have much I was expecting to come from it. I didn't know how open Keller was going to be. I didn't know how much time he was going to give me, and the fact that it was an almost 2 hour long conversation, and Keller really opened up during that conversation, I think kind of really speaks to this weird intangible everyone talks about that I have, where I can get people to open up and just kind of talk at length about something that they haven't before.
Yeah, I mean, I ran into him, Keller, at a show that he was playing with Zayo. I mean, huge shocker there. I drove 5 hours to Tennessee to see Zayo play, and Holy and Gold was opening for Zayo, and I really enjoyed their set. And I went and talked to him after the show, and he was telling me about when he was on the podcast, and he was just like, well, he goes, it's the weirdest thing. He's like, I was just talking to the dude, and before I knew it, like 2 hours had gone by, and I felt like I was just talking to an old friend. I wasn't talking to just some person that I'd been texting or whatever. And that was kind of like, for me, one of those, like, that's the kind of show that I want to be a part of, is that kind of just dudes just sitting there having beers talking. And luckily we've even if it doesn't always feel that way with the guests, it definitely feels that way with like just John and I talking. That's typically what's going on on every episode, which is why we kind of took the step to focus the show, at least partially on like, well, what are we drinking? What are we having? It's like showing up at the bar to have that conversation, but also you have to have a conversation about what you're going to drink while you're having that talk.
Right. Yeah, that was, and the pseudo unfortunate thing, I guess, from that one was a little bit of the fallout involving the reason Keller and the other person, I can't remember who his name off the top of my head, were had to leave the Chariot. So I mean, I don't think a lot of places ran it, but I think that was one that made the PRP and was kind of one of those that when you see it in a headline, you're like, oh god. But it's like when
it was a hot button.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it's like when you hear it in the context of how it actually was said, it wasn't quite as damning, for lack of no pun intended or whatever. But it was also one of those things where I think like the thing I enjoy about podcasts, and I enjoy about the people who are willing to do this with me, is people who are willing to be honest and sincere about how they felt about something. And like I said in that episode, it's like I've never had something that I started be taken away. and called, like, put to rest without my say so and or my involvement in any of it. It would be like, if 2-3 years down the road, Dan's like, well, I now run this podcast, it's my podcast, and I decided that I'm putting it down, and it's like, it was my thing. Like, how the fuck are you gonna how are you gonna call it a day when I had nothing to do with its demise or its end? Like, that's just, I don't know, it's very weird. So,
well, I'll just tell you that Jesus told me, that we need to lay it down, and by we I mean me, because it's all about me, really.
I think that's as good of a segue as any into I'll say, like, our number 7 episode of the year, and one that is still getting a lot of downloads because of how wide it got shared. Greg Tribbett from Audiotopsy, Mudvayne, hell yeah. That was one I had no clue what really to expect. Truth be told, with some of these interviews, I get the caveat of, like, don't talk about X, Y, or Z. Dan has even been privy to an email I got a little while ago where it basically said no provocative topics.
Right, nothing clickbaity. Don't go on these. Yeah.
And so it was kind of amusing, is in the preface to setting up the interview. And full disclosure, it wasn't really an interview I wanted. I'm not a super big fan of the band, but also in doing this, I've kind of tried to learn to be more open to different bands and interviews of people I may not know, because, everyone's got an interesting story. And if I just take a little bit of time to do some research and find something that I can talk to this person about, maybe some cool stuff will happen. The thing, too, and the caveat, if you haven't listened to it or you've seen the thing of, the whole Mudvayne reunion thing's not going to or it's going to take more time, whatever the exact phrase was. The thing about that is, I mean, it's hard to talk about a band that is basically a supergroup consisting of members of Scrape and Mudvayne. I mean, you have half of each band, basically. And if you go back and listen, I was very thorough in always saying Scrape and Mudvayne. Like, is it unfair that people still, even now with the second record in, that you get probably unfairly compared to Scrape and Mudvayne? I always put Scrape first. I always threw them in there because that's, I thought, the most fair way to ask that question. Because there is another band and another band set of fans that are also chiming in. And so for Greg to kind of, I mean, more or less fly off the handle at that question, it was like, Jesus. It was like, I wasn't expecting you to get all butthurt about it, but on the same token, it's like, I guess that question probably has been asked a bunch to him, maybe in varying levels of different ways, but I was really shocked, and I think it goes to exactly what I said in that interview, which is, but isn't it great to see such loyal support from Mudvayne fans that they still want to fucking see you guys come back all these years, like 10 years later, and that thing just fucking blew up. It still is blowing up. Like, it probably gets about 50-60 downloads a week at least, and that story hasn't been relevant in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, his reaction to it was so extreme. I mean, he didn't, like, tell John to fuck off or anything, but, like, it was definitely one of those questions that, like, if you don't ask it, you're ignoring the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and I think that his reaction was very indicative. I mean, that might have made or broke some fans, like, as far as, like, whether or not they care necessarily about the fans, which, I mean, he backtracked on that a little bit, later on, but, like, it still, was very, like, well, don't expect it anytime soon.
Right.
Fuckers. Like, it was definitely in there. And, that was one of the most interesting, that was one of the interviews that I unfortunately wasn't able to be on, but, like, listening back to it, I remember, thinking, like, oh my God, like, this is gonna blow up. And I think that the way he answered the question was kind of in a way to try to avoid that, to like keep that from happening.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, the damage was done. It's like, if you just say, like, hey, if you're waiting for a Mudvayne reunion, you're not gonna fucking get it.
Yeah.
And that blew my mind. but definitely was one of the bigger episodes for us just because of that reaction alone.
Speaking to probably the biggest reaction as far as the widespread news making of this thing, and an episode that actually Dan was on was our Joey Gonzalez of Superjoint and of Philip H. Anselmo and the Illegals.
Yeah.
That was a really fun one. Like, I know, admittedly, Dan's not a Pantera or Phil Anselmo band, insert whatever band supporter, and, has been pretty staunch about it on discography discussion, even to the detriment of Toomey's mental, capacity of accepting that someone could not like Pantera.
Right.
So it was really interesting. It was very interesting to me to have Dan be a part of this, and I know right away, we start the interview and he had van issues the day before, and he's in the middle of some nowhere town, I forget where, and spoiler alert, breaking kayfabe here. Dan and I usually have a Facebook Messenger app open or something like that, so we can talk to each other just in the event that maybe our Skype connection delays and we don't step on each other or whatever. It's right. Okay, hey, you go with this question, whatever. So in that, almost immediate, Dan was sent me a message, he's oh, this is gonna go so easy, it's like a good old boy, I can easily talk to these guys, this is gonna be great. And again, kind of more to some of these other interviews we've already talked about. Joey was super gracious with his time. I think we talked for an hour and a half.
Yeah, I mean, he was getting car work done,
Yeah.
and so I mean, obviously we all know how long that ends up taking. It's usually 2 hours after they say it's gonna take,
Right.
But no, I remember jumping into that conversation and being a little bit nervous at first because I have talked some mad shit on Pantera and on Philip H. Anselmo, especially. And so I didn't really know how it was going to go.
Yeah.
Because, obviously, I'm a human being. I'm an adult. I'm not going to, throw out all my fucking misconceptions about this artist because, at the end of the day, we're still there to interview him and find out what's going on, with that band and everything. So it's I'm going to keep it really professional. I'm not going to ask anything that's going to be, super controversial.
And then I said, hold my beer.
Right. And then Don went and did his thing. And, because, I mean, if you listen back to the interview, all of my questions are, really vanilla, as far as, well, what's the set list look like for Phil Anselmo and the Illegals, Are you guys playing some Pantera tunes? Or are you guys playing, some Superjoint stuff? Or, what? I don't remember exactly what it was I asked, but, but then, after talking to him for a while and then John, after you asked your question about, do you think that, what do you think about how people reacted to this whole Dime Bash thing? And the reaction that he gave, was fantastic and actually helped me out a lot as far as my perspective on Phil and on Pantera and on, the Dime Bash events and all that. It actually was really good for me, somebody that was kind of more of a hater when we started the conversation. And I remember getting off the phone and being I like that dude.
Right.
He was great to talk to. We actually, in listening to the album, this was one of the cool cases where we got to listen to the album. I think it was already out already, but
yeah,
to the whole thing. And I read the lyrics as I typically do. And, I was I think this one's okay. I kind of liked it. It was a harder style for Phil. It wasn't stoner rock, or it was definitely more of in the grind, almost death metal type of sound, and that's a lot more up my alley. And so we ended up talking a lot about the lyrical themes behind the albums, and that the album. That's what really upset me was that when that interview broke, we released it. And it got picked up by all these news sites, and all they wanted to talk about was the Dime Bash event and what Phil said and how Joey was defending him and all that. And I was fuck, but if you listen to the interview, it was actually a really good interview,
right?
And we talked about a lot of really cool stuff other than that, and So it's just kind of funny how like the news outlets kind of grab something and just kind of hold on to it like that.
Yeah,
And
that was. I think that was one of the first episodes since Dan had come on that really just took off like that. To where like he's sending me like, oh, I found it here, or hey, I found it here. Or I'm going like, yo, did you read this comment?
yeah, it was for like a couple of weeks after it had released.
Yeah.
It was a long time, and even now we're still finding stuff that we missed during the first sweep through.
Yeah, when checking the stats, just kind of like I said in the beginning of the episode, of a lot of you, but going back through and listening to old episodes, I saw because I can see where the clicks are coming from which website, so on and so forth, and I saw something that just said Kerrang.com, and I was like, Kerrang? I was like, I haven't made anything on Kerrang, and so I clicked the link, and sure as shit, apparently that story made it all the way to Kerrang magazine, so we went international with that. And that was huge.
Something that I thought was funny too is at the bottom of that Kerrang article, it says blabbermouth.com was kind enough to pull to transcript the audio so that we didn't have to.
The kind of crazy thing about that one, just having the legs on it, was that was actually one of the first times I'd technically gotten in trouble. We got an email the next day that basically was like, can you take Phil's name off of this? I was getting text messages from some of the guys on tour that apparently the whole tour was up in arms and caused for some really shitty couple hours, basically dealing with the backdraft of backdraft. Is that what I mean to say?
Well,
backlash,
yeah, like
the backlash of
of
that thing, and it's kind of one of those things where within 24 hours or so, or not even of everything going, it turns into this thing where it's like, well, can you take his name off? And it's like, well, if you ever look at any of the episodes, I always have the person's name and the band that they're in, or the few bands they're in.
The name of the band, yeah.
And unfortunately, it's not my fault that Phil put his whole fucking name on a band. So it's like, okay. And then the other thing, too, that I kind of want to go back to is just like, okay, so I take his name off. That doesn't take away any of the headlines that have already been made. So,
well, yeah, and my whole issue with it was, objectively, it doesn't do anything other than paint Philip H as like a positive figure.
Yeah, I agree.
I couldn't wrap my head around it. Like, he wasn't like, oh my God, Phil's a dick. It's all true. He treats me like shit because I'm a minority or whatever. Like,
we actually got confirmation from Joey that he sent a text and was like, "Oh, Phil saw this and thanked me as in Joey, and then wanted to thank you two for getting the real story out there, the real news out there from someone that knows him and is associated with him." So it was so weird. That was just like I said, seeing Kerrang run it and just kind of seeing the comments that popped up from that. It's. My year's done, and some of these interviews, I completely forgot how long or how old they were. It just is like, it's like as soon as the interview's done and we get it posted, it's like on to the next one. You kind of forget. So it's been kind of weird in going back and preparing this list. It's like I kind of had forgotten all of the controversy, we'll say, surrounding this episode. Like it was everywhere.
Yeah, and like Joey was totally cool with us, and like, I think he even tried sending us like tickets to a show.
Yeah, I felt really bad, so I didn't want to go.
Yeah, I couldn't make it, unfortunately, but I was thinking about going, but I don't remember what it was. Like, I had to work late or something. Or something like that. But like, I was actually planning on going for a little while, and because I think it was like a guest list kind of thing.
Yeah.
And all I would have had to do was show up and give my name or whatever, which would be like so weird, right? Like, I wanted to go to the show just so I could text Toomey and be all like, I'm on Philip H. and it's almost guest list, like, that sort of thing. But like, I'm kind of bummed I didn't get to go because I wanted to meet Joey and shoot the shit with him, for a little while, and if they roll back into town, I'm definitely going to do that, because he was a cool dude and I really enjoyed talking to him, like way more than I thought, because like, when you told me like, oh, we're going to talk to him and, you need to be on your best behavior and all that shit, and all that. And I was like, oh, okay, no promises, but I'll do my best,
Yeah.
And then it ended up being a really great conversation, and that's what I took away from it. Like beyond all the controversy behind his answer to one question, like I away from that being like that was a really good chat with a dude that I probably wouldn't have talked to, any other way.
Right. Yeah, I think another I think another one that was really interesting too, and definitely speaking of controversy, is my episode with Brandan Schiepatti of Bleeding Through.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, did that one just go?
That was before me, but that was a great fucking episode, dude.
That was one where, and the crazy thing is like that was really the very beginning of me trying not to really have a lot of questions written down and just kind of seeing like if something pops up, then it's like okay, like I guess let's just go there. And so something had kind of occurred to me as we're talking, and I'm like, you've been gone for a while, the band that is, and at this point, they're getting ready to just put out their new record, and I got to give it to the Bleeding Through camp, like, and their publicity team. They had staggered all their interviews and so forth that it seemed like the month leading up to it, there was something every other day that was getting national headlines. And the other thing is too, though, is that I saw on my whatever episode specifically, the news that it made of him basically saying bands learned how to, or producers and everyone learned how to polish a turd, and that it's taking the old school bands to come back. Because the question I had asked him was, in light of, at that point I had just gone to see 18 Visions play in LA. Atreyu had already come back and we're working on the second record that was coming out since their return. And Walls of Jericho had come back. Like, you were starting to see a lot of these older bands coming back, and I was like, as someone who owns a gym and probably plays a lot of heavy metal and stuff like that for the people to get pumped up, it's like, what were you listening to that made you really want to be like, yo, like, I need to get back into this? And for him to be like, it wasn't so much of the things that made me want to get back into it, it was the bullshit I was hearing that made me upset, that made me want to come back and show people how it needed to be done. And so, like, at that point, it's like, I was totally expecting him to be like, oh man, it was Code Orange forever, like, that record, it fucking slams, or, the Knocked Loose record that came out like 2 years ago, or, I was expecting it to go there and him to shine some good, like, put over some of the younger bands, but instead he basically shit on like everybody.
Everyone, yeah. And like, I don't disagree with him at all. That was the thing I loved about it, because I was like, no, he's right.
Yeah.
Like 100%.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one where it was like, as it was happening, I remember just being like, wow, that was something.
That was eye-opening. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was a great interview, man, and like one of the better ones, because I know he did a lot of interviews with a lot of other podcasts, and that one was like the least vanilla, out of all of them. Is he just really was like, you know what, fuck it, people learn how to polish a turd, like, people don't work for it, and like, that's all stuff that like we want to hear from somebody, and to hear it from him, like with Bleeding Through and being a band that I listened to for so long when I was younger, that like it just totally made sense, and I appreciated his honesty like 100%.
Yeah, it was one of those too, and what the comment I started to make a minute ago was that someone made a comment that it was like, man, I really hate these interviews. You can tell that everyone just asked the same thing. You can tell they were all done back to very short amount of time from each other, because everyone's asking the same questions. And honestly, as someone who, I mean, part of that is true. Because they made it, I think the person who made that comment made it seem like it was a thing of, like, oh, well, I heard, like, we'll use Toomey example as the example. So, oh, well, I heard him on Toomey's thing, so this guy must have heard the things he said and just basically asked the same questions. And it's like, no, like, when that dude, like, Brandon's doing, I think if I remember correctly, he was doing like a 7-hour block of press or something like that, or 5 hours, 30-minute interviews, like back to back to back to back to back, just stacked up one after another. So it's like, I'm sure his answers do become somewhat similar. And I've always said that, like, Toomey and I are pretty in tune with each other. Like, we think a lot alike in the way that we approach some of our questions. And
well, yeah.
And so
same guests, you guys.
Yeah.
Kind of conference to make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes.
No, yeah. And so it was one of those where like when people are like, "Oh, you can tell like, these reporters get lazy and they just ask the same questions." And it's like, "How about you go into a 30-minute interview with someone you've never talked to and know that they have press on either end of you for the next few hours?"
Right.
And I'm sure you're gonna, however clever you may think you are, you're gonna run into some of the same fucking questions, unless you're gonna ask about TV series.
Right.
uh,
Oh my god, that's a fucking deep cut right there.
yeah. Um, that's probably one of my favorites of this year. Just a random
Oh
joke
yeah.
between Dan and I.
We got
Um,
we'll explain that later on.
yes. Another fun one that Dan was a part of though, actually was my art interview with Blasko.
Oh yeah, dude, that was one of my first episodes, like one of my first interviews, and yeah, that was a ton of fun.
I mean, it was super short and quick, and the funny thing is like the prepper. I think Dan kind of got a very crash course in how I maybe overly prepare.
Yeah, yeah, no shit. You're like, here's all the questions I have. You got anything other than that? And I was like, well, a lot of the shit that I was gonna ask is just what you're gonna ask anyway. But like it, I have never like. I mean, like on my other podcast, like I cram shit really fast a lot of the time. But like this was a whole different level, a whole new level.
Right.
And like he's like, Blasko, because I knew Blasko from he was in Ozzy Osbourne's band, is still in Ozzy Osbourne's band as far as I know.
Yep.
I don't know how it works with it being the last tour or whatever, but like in Ozzy Osbourne's band, and then he was in Cryptic Slaughter, I believe, and like so I knew him from that, but like John's like, no, you gotta, and like he does obviously the managemental podcast, and so I knew him from that too, but like he's like, no, he has a new podcast where all he does is talk to industry insiders, and you need to listen to like every episode of it,
All 10 of
because
them.
it was released all at once, and I listened to all of it in like 2 days.
Yep.
Before this interview, and it was yeah, it was definitely a crash course in like, holy shit, I got to get like up on my game on this stuff, and it turned out great because like again, it's so much easier for us when we're talking to another podcaster.
Yes.
Because like they get it like 100%. If there's anything like rough around the edges or whatever, like they'll kind of roll with it. But I didn't feel like that was the case either. And some of the answers that he gave were pretty cool, and really honest. And that's what I appreciated about it the most.
I think the two things that I thought were interesting, one of them obviously being the one that made the news, I think for Blabbermouth. At that point, Dan and I had recently, and the rest of the discography discussion guys, had gotten into the 4-hour long discussion about Esley Dying's career over
yeah.
a discography discussion. And so it was really weird, the timing of all of this, where basically we did this interview. Dan let me pick a band I want to talk about. And for some reason, I just kind of was like, oh, Esley Dying. Like, I know they have a decent discography that you can kind of go on at length about. And, there's progression, it changes, and so on and so forth. Like, it should be a pretty fun, interesting chat.
Yeah, it was perfect. It was perfect for that show.
Yes. So, what we didn't know, but is very much how things happen in my life, actually. Within a week of you guys posting that?
Dude, it was like a couple of days.
Okay, that's what I was going to give us the benefit of the doubt, but...
My fucking socials blew up in a way that they have never blown up before. Like, we posted that episode, and then, like, I swear to God, like, a couple of days later, it was
Here
like...
comes this 30-second teaser.
Because we must have gone on for, like, at least an hour about what if the actual Esley Dying, like the actual members, everybody that was on the last album, what if it was all forgiven? They had gotten in contact with Tim and decided to bang out an album. And I remember being like staunchly like,
no,
it'll never fucking happen.
And
It'll
the weird
never happen. And we went back and forth on it forever on that episode. And then a teaser post, and we're like, and I remember like it was the craziest thing. Like our listener, like the discography discussion listeners, And I love every single one of you guys if you're listening to this, for doing this, for doing the legwork. Like, they were matching up people's fucking tattoos and stuff, like, to figure out, like,
and guitars.
Yeah, and their guitars and just everything. And they're like, guys, I think this is actually like a legit As I Lay Dying, thing. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know what to think. And then the single dropped, like there were all these leaks online of like the whole song, and you had Tim singing on it, and like it was this huge fucking thing. And I remember being like, oh my God, like this is the first time my podcast has ever been like relevant, like ever. And that shit posts, and then like it wasn't very long after that I had joined on for John's podcast, and he's like, we're gonna interview Blasko.
Well, then right before that, the explanation video dropped. So there's like, to kind of get the timeline into proper perspective. So then the Blasko thing goes on, and the thing, and sorry to cut Dan off. The thing about the Blasko interview is I also, and if you go back and listen to any of these interviews, I try to talk about the thing everyone kind of expects you to talk about, like the thing, but I also try to find other things to talk about within that maybe not everyone else is going to hit on. So, with knowing that Blasko is a band manager, has, experience doing that, that's what the Managemental podcast kind of covers, between him and Mike Mowry of Outer Loop Management and so forth. I kind of was like, oh, I'm going to ask him how he feels about this As I Lay Dying thing, because he had Brian Slagle on in the Managemental podcast, or I'm sorry, the A New Level podcast.
Yeah.
And it's just, there's too much circling itself where it's like, how do you, like, because Dan and I were having these questions just between the two of us, where it's like, okay, as a manager, how would you handle this? How do you handle this as a manager, as a record label, as a firm? Like, there's just so much to this that's never really been seen or been gone through. And so I was like, dude, we've got to ask Blasko, because like, how, like, because we spent an hour and a half on your podcast talking about the what ifs and how things would shake out. Then we spent another 30 minutes following the footage leaking. Then you and I spent countless hours going back and forth between, well, if they do a tour, will anyone go? Are they going to go back to Metal Blade? Would anyone sign them? Like, how does this look? How does this work? And it was one of those, I was like, dude, we've got to ask Blasko, because like, that's just, it's so, our 2 to 3 weeks was just so all-encompassing As I Lay Dying stuff. So it was just like, I was like, dude, I'll ask if you don't want to, but
yeah,
I just got it.
Real gun shy on that. Yeah.
I was like, dude, I gotta know. And the interesting thing was, like, once again, Blasko was very forthcoming and honest, although he was a little trepidatious of just being like, well, I wouldn't be in that situation. And,
Yeah. And that was great. I mean, that was such a great window into like how industry insiders probably do look at situations like this, and it's so funny because like even after that, it became even more cemented that As I Lay Dying is a band that's back.
They're and is killing it right now. No pun intended.
Thing. Yeah. They're selling out shows. They're doing all the shit that I said was never going to happen.
And I think I was championing that it would.
Episode. And yeah, I mean, it was perfect. And to have his perspective on it as well was really great. I enjoyed the rest of the conversation quite a bit too, where we talked a lot about some other things that were kind of pertinent too, like, like celebrities or rock stars, specifically for music. Like how those people had basically, they would just say anything on social media, and there was a time where that was like safe.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, no, now it's not safe at all. If like if you say anything, you're kind of fucked, like. And he gave his perspective on that, and I thought that was really cool. It's like how open he was with us, and I would like to think that the questions we asked him on that interview were a little bit different than what you would have expected on a normal music, type of podcast. And that's what we try to do, is just try to do things a little bit different, like just try to pull a perspective on it that maybe people hadn't thought of before.
I think really piggybacking off of that and going to what would now be, let's see, we did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this would be what would be the fourth story episode. And you weren't on at this point either. And maybe you listened to it, maybe you didn't, but can piggyback into a different episode you can talk about a little bit more for the same reason. But having King Gordy on, who is a part of the not Psychopathic Records, sorry, the NME record label, which is Twizded's record label.
Yeah.
And basically, I thought, we get emails for, hey, would you be interested in talking to so and so from this new group or this person, and whatever. And so King Gordy is a successful rapper in his own right, very much ensconced in that Juggalo rap scene. But he had done a new, quote-unquote, new project called Lars, Last of the American Rock Stars.
Yeah.
With Bizarre from D12. And so I thought, honestly, with me living in Michigan, I figured they would give me... I mean, King Gordy is in Detroit as well, so it's not like neither, like, one lives out of state. But I thought they would give me Bizarre, like that... I figured was the more bigger name to help push this endeavor. So when I found out I was going to talk to King Gordy, I went to a friend of mine at work who's big into that whole Juggalo rap scene and so forth, and just kind of picked his brain. I was like, okay, like, this is kind of what I think I'm going to talk about. Like, is this stupid, or like, is this a good question, or so on and so forth. Just kind of like did my due diligence, like I did with the Hope Swallow episode, but just in a completely different spectrum of music. And the interesting thing about King Gordy that I've always, in the brief research I was doing on him, is that he's just very outspoken, very himself, doesn't give a fuck about offending anyone or saying shit. Right. And so as a result, somehow we got to talking about, I think I had asked something along the lines of, like, do you think Twisted being so close protege-wise, like with the ICP thing and learning how to run a successful label and all the different stuff, do you feel that has allowed them to make all the right steps in putting the right roster together with NME and so forth and all you guys? Because it seems like it's a big family, and it doesn't seem like Psychopathic Records is like that anymore, like it used to be. And then he just went down this whole thing of being like, well, I think ICP, what they should have done was let them take over, Twisted that is, take over on Psychopathic and be like the A brand. ICP takes a back seat, only grows their brand and value, and basically, like, if they were to only come out at Gathering of the Juggalos or to do something big, it just makes them worth exponentially way more money. Yeah. And Fago Lovers, shout out to them, they ended up sharing the conversation, and that thing blew the fuck up. And as I've learned with anything related to any of that horrorcore and any of that kind of stuff, Juggalo world, their fans are rabid, and they are like us, like with the Esley Dying thing, like their fans and all the bands and artists' fans spend so much time debating and talking about these things. And so for basically someone to kind of put it into perspective, like Twisted is the shit now, and they're the group that's going to carry everything forward, and ICP is kind of getting stale, and maybe should have just financially realized that the best business is to put them and make them the face of something and kind of step back. And it was really crazy to see the outreach and the outpour of people just commenting on it. And like, I was getting tagged in shit on Twitter where people were like saying, like, myself and like King Gordy and other people were like, oh, we're just like dick riding faggots for Twisted and shit, and you're just like, what the fuck? Like, so I was getting tossed into this shit, and I was like, wow. And
well,
like,
that's true, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it was just really interesting to see how crazy that episode went. Like, I mean, I think that is the highest downloaded episode of this year. Like, to put it in perspective, like, I mean, some of the stories we're talking about, like, yes, they went further reaching on different outlets, but as far as pure downloads, that single-handedly is like the best episode to date.
Oh yeah, I mean, that kind of blew my mind when you told me that, because I was like, wow, like, more so than the Joey Gonzalez, more so than, but like, that's crazy to me that it would pull that much. But like, that just, what I said, even on the Twisted episode, was that like, this community cannot be denied.
No. And, and I think the other thing too, and I kind of wanted to hit on it too, because we collectively, between you and I, have gotten a lot of praise for this on the Twisted episode, especially on YouTube, is everybody commending the fact that we approach it and say flat out, like, we're not super knowledgeable on this realm of music. We don't know a whole lot about these bands, but instead of shitting on it for being something we don't know, that we're like you were very adamant on that episode of saying, like, I have more respect. I didn't want to do the episode. Now I kind of been bummed when I heard it, like, oh, this would have been so much fun. And so, a lot of people were really giving us credit for that, because they themselves aren't used to hearing outsiders talk like that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to do it at all. Like, I was like, oh, what are you doing this? Like, and I remember being like, this is not something I wouldn't even want to be associated with. And I, like, even said flat out on the episode, like, I was like, I don't get it. Yeah, like, at all. But after seeing the community and seeing the outpouring of support that was there, and sometimes not support. I mean, sometimes, people are fucking terrible sometimes. But, like, for the most part, though, like, it was very eye-opening to me, because, like, I always thought of, like, the Fago community and all that shit, like, that it was, like, even now I'm calling it shit. Like, look at me. But I thought of it as something that, like, had passed over already, like something that didn't really exist now.
Right.
In 2018. So when we did that Twisted episode, I was kind of like, okay, so there really is still a market for this. There's an active community, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
So, like, I need to fucking change my perspective at least a little bit on it, and maybe try to get it. And I'm not quite there yet. I still don't totally get it. But after listening to that King Gordy episode and then, the Twisted one, I was like, I don't have a problem with these dudes at all.
Right.
Like, I kind of get where they're coming from.
So
that's just small progress.
Yeah. Kind of actually putting myself in your shoes of how you've been with some of these guests, being a little trepidatious and being like, I just never really been a fan of this. I don't get it. Going to probably, I think the third biggest episode that we had this year, Craig Owens, formerly of Chiodos, formerly of Drugs, currently Bad Channels. That was one where in a Facebook group I'm a part of, full of a lot of media people, Ray Roldan, I think is how you say his name, had basically just signed Craig to, like, as a management publicist, whatever, and I figured so many people were gonna jump at the opportunity to interview him, and that I wasn't gonna have I wasn't big enough to get someone like Craig. And
right.
So I remember sending an email to Ray, and I was like, I'm probably not on the level that you would want Craig to be associated with, but, like, because I've been following, for some reason, like, it's almost like that whole thing of, like, we follow and know so much about things that we don't care about for some reason. Like, I've never been a big Chiodos fan. I live here in Michigan. Like, it's always been that thing where it's like, yeah, I know who they are, and I I've seen all the photos and magazine covers with Craig and all that kind of stuff, but it's never my thing.
Same.
But it was one of those things where somehow I started, like, he always was an intriguing guy, and I liked him as a guy. And so I was following him. I've been following him on all of his socials for a long time. And so the project, this Bad Channels thing, I have been aware of for a long time. And so, like, as he's raised, like, oh, he's got this new thing, I remember sending him an email, and I was like, I've known of this project for a while. I've kind of seen it progress to these various things. Like, I'd like to talk to Craig if you would let me. And thankfully he did. And, I did a lot of my preparation, but, like, I just did what I think I always do, which is I just kind of paid attention to him. I just did a little bit of digging, and it's like, okay, you pay attention to what he's posting, pay attention to the things that he does, and it kind of will tell you the story that he's trying to tell, that you can just kind of get it out of him. And it was really weird because, like, at times I felt really pretentious myself about being like, oh, well, I knew about this product, this thing before anybody else and whatever. And I've kind of tried to learn not to be so that, but the thing is, though, is that was one of the first interviews where I really felt like I did something. Like, when it was done, I was like, that was like magic in a bottle, I guess. I don't really know how to describe it. Like, there is something that happened in that interview for both Craig and I, like, that is just, like Craig uses it, and like I know one of the managers that was working with them was using it in EPKs because of how well we were able to talk about where Craig came from with Chiodos, to like with the emo night stuff where I talked about the reimagining of Baby You Wouldn't Last a Minute on the Creek, or whatever that song is that he did in the YouTube video I talked about, where I was like, oh, did you redo it this way so that way people like it? You can be like, well, we'll go check out my new thing, Bad Channels. Like this, it's very much in this same vein. And, you know, just to have someone tell me like, oh my God, you get it. You get everything I'm trying to do. Like, it felt so good. And I know it felt good for Craig because like when he was done, like he was just like, that was so great that he shared it on like everything and paid money, like to me, sent me a text and was like, congratulations. I've never seen an artist actually spend money to sponsor them promoting the episode that you did with them.
Yeah, that was cool.
And it was just so weird. And
I remember being jealous too, like, cause I saw that, you know, through all the socials that get reshared and stuff, and being like, fuck, I need to like start getting more people on my podcast, you know, because like, you know, but that was very unusual, you know, for what we normally get, you know, like you can't expect the artist to share everything, but like it definitely was like that was around the time that I started like really paying attention to John's Title podcast, you know, because I was like, oh man, like I always tell this story, but like I remember actually being like, because I mean I became aware of the podcast probably January or February of this year.
Yeah, so not too, about probably 5 months into the whole thing.
Yeah, and like I remember being like, because I think we had an episode with Rob Rivera of Nonpoint, which posted really early in January, and I remember the next day or something, it was just like John's Title podcast, Rob Rivera, and like I remember being like kind of irritated by it, like that's you know, who is this fucking guy? What is he doing? And then like with that whole thing with Greg, you know, I was just like, damn, like you know, how's he doing this? You know, like, you know, and that's when I started listening to it and being like, because I listened to that interview. I don't know if it was the first episode I listened to or not. It's all kind of hazy from back then, but like, I remember being like, wow, okay, so this is like some really, you know, in-depth interviewing. Because I mean, like before that, the only podcast I listened to that really did that was Toomey's podcast, and you know, like I mean, he still continues to do it. You know, is that kind of like really in-depth, kind of under the skin. But like what I liked about that interview was that like how informed, because like I didn't know that you weren't a big Chiodos fan, you know,
not at all.
going into that interview, but like I didn't get that from listening to it, and so it was kind of shocking to me to find out later that like, oh yeah, like he's, you know, but I mean it's cool, and like it's just like a testament of like, you know, how far you've come as far as interviewing people and kind of getting into the nitty gritty, and that's what I loved that, and I remember being like really jealous of like, fuck, you know, like the guy, because I remember at that point I was like, man, the guy we just had on our podcast didn't share shit, you know, like, and you like being irritated or whatever, but like, yeah, to keep in mind whenever I say stuff like that is that discography discussion is a massively different type of podcast.
Oh, totally.
You know, and so, you know, I can't really expect that, you know, from what we do over there, but you know, like that was definitely one of the first episodes that I couldn't help but stop and take notice. Like, oh wow, you know, like
that was too. It was so weird because like when I got done with it, that was where I felt like something changed. That was the turning point of what I was doing versus how I knew it could be or what I wanted it to try to be every time. And it's so weird because it's like, I don't know if it comes. I mean, this is the first. Actually, I think this is the first we've actually ever talked about that episode at all. So I mean, this is news to me. But it's one of those things that, you know, I felt it, and I don't know if people can feel it when they listen to it, because sometimes, at times, this is the, and Craig had to kind of put it into perspective for me, which sounds kind of shitty, but I was getting really bummed that a lot of his fans were getting shitty about me, like, oh, he's talking too much, or this entitledness that he has or whatever. And it definitely has made me try not to be like that since. But it's like Craig said, he goes, at the end of the day, the only two people that matter are the two people having the conversation. And he goes, and I can't speak for you. He goes, but I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was really great. You came, you knew what you listened, you got things that I have been doing as an artist, and as someone who has done countless interviews for a decade plus, like that's not always like that what happened in that interview doesn't always happen. Frequently it does not happen. So like that speaks volumes about you and your preparedness or over preparedness, I guess, at times. But like I said, that was one looking back, and even I went back and listened to it the other day, and I was just like, man, that was the turning point for me for the podcast, where I was like, I think I can continue to do this longer because of an episode like this.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was definitely like a big deal. At least it was to me, because I definitely felt like, and I'm not just saying it to stroke the ego or whatever, but like, like it was definitely before I was on the podcast, and it made me take notice, because like before that I really wasn't listening to too many other people's podcasts, and so that kept me on as a listener. But to your point about people being shitty about like, oh, he talks too much, or this or that or this or that, like for me, I had to become engaged with the host, because on the next interview I don't have Greg on there.
Right.
I've got the guy that I was with the first episode I listened to. So I think to a certain extent it is important for the host to reveal somewhat of themselves, in these interviews, so that you get kind of a feel for like what kind of interview style they have, or because they're who we're going to be listening to, listening to the intros and the outros and whatnot. And it definitely kept me on board. I mean, that's whenever I became aware, I started listening, and then I was going to reach out to you to do an episode of the podcast, and then I think like the week before I did that, you were on Toomey's podcast as a co-host, and that was a little bit later, but like you were on Toomey's podcast, and I was like, oh fuck, we got to get him on. And then that was right before we did the Ashley Dying episode. Obviously the rest is history, but it's just that was one of the first episodes that I really like kind of had no choice but to stop and take notice.
Right. That's good to know. I mean, it was that it was felt, and it's kind of the other reason I kind of wanted to go through these too. I mean, it's funny because earlier, leading up to us doing this conversation, we were debating, do we do a top 10 records of the year? And I was kind of like, we could do that, and maybe we still might. I don't know. But it was one of those things where I was like, I feel like with us being on Metal Nexus now, with us having like almost 150 episodes in the archive, it just turns into one of those things. It's like, it just seems like a really good time to look back at this year in the podcast, because so much has changed. I mean, it's like from like when you came on in like January, February-ish, like I'd only been doing this like 5-6 months, and this year alone, really, you can see a huge growth, leaps, bounds. So much has changed that I was like, I feel like it'd almost be a disservice to really, for both of us to look back at the year where it was just me, where it was what got you into it, bringing you in, like, with the Hopes Fall episode, then the Blasko interview, and to even talking about now, like, that we're on Metal Nexus, the name change. Like, this has been a really interesting year for this podcast. Like, it's wild, and it's like every time I kept thinking about it, it's like, I think this is the perfect time to look back on it and give people really kind of a behind the scenes, not only of the big episodes, but just kind of maybe entice you to be like, okay, I'm gonna go check out this episode. I'm not a Craig Owens fan, but you two were talking about it from the different perspectives that you each had. Now I'm intrigued. Now I'm gonna go back and listen to it. And it's like, okay, like that's kind of, I don't know. Sometimes like that's kind of why I want to include more of us in these things, because I think it kind of, I don't know. I just kind of kept coming back to that, so I'm really kind of glad, we're kind of getting into this and kind of, looking back on some of these things, like, like some of the things where you're like, oh my god, I forgot about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of speaking to, and we got like 2-3 more to go. Kind of another fun one that was interesting to look back on for a myriad of reasons, honestly. Labonte, All That Remains. breaking the news that the new record was done, and boy, did we not know how fast that was getting ready to come out.
Yeah, dude, that thing dropped immediately. And I remember, like, when he said that, I was like, oh, fuck, what's this pop rock bullshit going to sound like now? And, man, was I wrong. Like, I've been really wrong about shit this year.
I mean, at least on this podcast, I can't speak to discography discussion.
Well, I mean, I was dead wrong on the Absolutely Dying stuff for sure. But, so that's credibility, you know. Subscribe right now.
Yeah. But yeah, that was a really interesting one. I mean, it's kind of horrible audio of of us being at the intersection here in Grand Rapids, with the drum basically being in a green room right on stage as a band was playing. Can hear a pretty cool Deftones cover, if I remember correctly, being played right before the end of the band's set. But it was kind of interesting hearing Phil. Basically, I had to submit the questions. The interview got approved super last minute. I think like less than 24 hours, and was one of those I had to submit questions. And I'm, like I have been saying, I've been trying to get in the habit of just kind of being more present in asking things and seeing where the answers lead me. But sometimes I have to submit answers or questions beforehand, so that way they know, like, if they want the person to even do an interview with me. Right. And so, everything I asked is exactly what I wrote down. So I was pleasantly surprised that when I was like, oh, is this? I think this is the end of your touring cycle, roughly. Like, are new songs already being written? What does the new record sound like, maybe, or the new ideas? And then he's just like, yeah, it's done. It's been done for a little bit. And you're like, oh, like I'm sure my face probably couldn't have been more like, holy shit, because that's not the answer I was expecting at all.
Yeah, you struck gold and you weren't even mining. Yeah,
and I was Bitcoining, and the other interesting thing, in light of the news of us, changing the name and announcing that and the socials and all that kind of stuff, I've had a couple people reach out to me and ask me how, even though we talk about it in the interview, so I thought it was kind of weird, or on the episode, but asked me how soon before the chat I did with Aaron from All That Remains did the Oli incident happen. Yeah. And I was like, dude, it was kind of wild because, like, we're kind of wrapped up with with Hesley dying, with All That Remains stuff between, basically breaking the news that the new All That Remains record was done, then a single gets dropped. So then it was kind of weird because we got double dipped on that, where people would be like, earlier last week or something like that on this, and then they would reshare the story with the single being dropped almost everywhere. So we got we were really ensconced in All That Remains world for probably 2.5-3 weeks. And then basically me talking with Aaron Patrick, the bass player, which was a fun chat too. So go back and listen to that one. A little bit of another kind of all over the place chat. But while we were preparing to do the intros and get that episode out, that was when Oli passed away. And during my interview with Phil, Oli was literally in the room the whole time just practicing guitar. So it was kind of a really, I don't know, how, like I said during the Hesley dying thing, like when we were talking about that earlier, like how, like, that's my life. My life is full of weird things that happen like that, where in the moment you don't think anything of it, but then it's like, as certain things keep happening, you're like, that's really weird that this panned out the way it did. So it's like the fact that I basically, had the unique opportunity to interview Phil, but like there's Oli, and then at the very end, it's like, hey, I'm John, blah blah blah, just pleasantries while you're in a room with somebody. Sure. And then it's just like, oh man, like, and then weeks later it's like, oh, now he's dead. And then it was even weirder to see, Matt from CKY, who used to be in All That Remains, start sharing all this, what I thought was like fodder for like just bullshit, like conspiracies and stuff about like, oh, maybe he was murdered or whatever. And then it's like, now that story has taken the crazy turns that thing has, it's just like, oh my gosh, like this is wild.
There's a YouTube rabbit hole on all that
I haven't gone down it yet. No.
Yeah.
But that was a really crazy month basically of just All That Remains stuff.
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting episode and time frame that kind of, when thinking about that, it was just like, oh man, that was such a
bad time period,
just weird timing.
We had the We Came as Romans thing.
Yep.
Go down around the same time, and there's just too much.
Yeah. I didn't know which one of these two I wanted to talk about, so I'll quickly talk about either one or both. Um, One of the first really big guests that I had gotten on the podcast, Jose from Incubus.
Oh yeah.
Granted, it was only 15 minutes, but I got something out of that interview that kind of caught the attention of the PRP and a few other places, and talking about the possibility of, in 2019, will we get a Make Yourself 20-year tour? And the fact that apparently the band had been discussing it. So I'm really interested to see if we really will get a Make Yourself tour. I mean, I'll gladly go to
Dude,
that.
I'd be there for that for
Yeah.
sure. That was, yeah, like you said, one of the shorter interviews, but I mean that was the piece of the puzzle that, it'd be really nice to have that tour.
Yeah.
Let's say, I mean, just seriously, just announce it. I'll fucking buy my tickets right now.
And speaking, we're going to wrap this episode up as we took a look back at the podcast 2018. We are BREWtally speaking, BREW. So we didn't talk about it in the beginning because I kind of wanted to roll right into the meat and potatoes of what we wanted to do with this. But Dan, what were you drinking tonight?
I had about 4 cans of Arrogant Bastard Ale, which is made by Stone Brewery. It's a pretty it's a kind of an aggressive ale. It's not an IPA or anything like that, but it's a little rough. It's 7.2%, and it's one of my favorite beers because on discography discussion, that's actually where I'm at right now. I'm at the discography discussion studio, and we just did our 100th episode tonight, and so I drank quite a few of these Arrogant Bastard ales, and it's definitely one of my favorites, almost more so for the aesthetic than it is anything else. It's it's definitely a it's funny because there's a banner on the bottom of it that says "You're not worthy." It's got this demon on the front of it holding a giant mug of beer, and it's like "You're not worthy." And then I just love what it says at the bottom. It's like a questions or comments. If you don't like this beer, keep it to yourself. We don't want to hear from any sniveling yellow beer drinking wimps because this beer wasn't made for you.
That's great.
And yeah, it's one of my favorites, man. It definitely lines up really well with kind of the persona that I put on for discography discussion, and it works out really well. It's definitely one of my favorite beers to drink while I'm podcasting.
I unfortunately, through the last just handful of days, drinking quite a bit, celebrating my anniversary with my wife. If you go to our social media pages, trying to incorporate a little bit more of the various drinks we're having and so forth, but I'm taking it easy tonight, just enjoying a nice Diet Coke. But the other night, if you go to our Instagram page, Brew Speak Pod, keep it real easy, but we'll get to the socials in a second. I've made a New Year's resolution that I want to learn more about craft cocktails and the actual making of it and so forth. So one of the drinks that I had been looking at, I had one of my favorite bartenders who I think I'm going to have on the podcast here in the next little bit to share a drink recipe with us, because I think something I'd like to do is maybe have a drink of the week for the podcast and have various bartender friends and so forth recommend a beer or a drink that they are feeling outside of us. So Ariel at Bar Devani here in Grand Rapids, I showed her the recipe for a Giro d'Italia. Basically, it is 2 ounces of bourbon, 3/4 ounce fresh lemon juice, 3/4 ounce agave syrup. Here's where it gets interesting. The drink actually calls for 2 cherry tomatoes. She didn't have any, so she asked if how I felt about beets, and I am not a fan of beets, but I was like, you know what? Go ahead and do what you think is going to be good for this drink. So she, instead of actually adding beet juice, which would have really given it that beet flavor, she actually just put a little bit of a beet in it, and kind of gave it a nice red, kind of like a light red color to it, and 5 fresh basil leaves. Basically, it comes in a like a rocks glass over like a square cube of ice. It was really good. Really, really, really good. Had a really nice smoky flavor, which was kind of odd because it wasn't smoked and nothing was smoked, but it was kind of interesting just to get that. Used bullet bourbon, so that's probably where the smoky flavor came from. But it was just a really good, interesting drink as a whole. So that was something I had this week that I was really shocked and wowed by, where I was like, wow, that's really good. Speaking to everything else, though, we are going to wrap up this episode. If you would like to follow us on all of the socials, you can find us at all new handles now. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at BrewSpeakPod. Super easy. I wanted to make it easy for everybody because that shit sucks when you have like 19 different social media handles to learn. So we are simply available at BrewSpeakPod on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you to everybody who has been recommending us, liking the page. We were really apprehensive about starting all new socials, but everyone's been really supportive in liking those. Please continue to do that. That is how this podcast grows. Big shout out to Metal Nexus, to Fist at Metal Nexus, and everybody at Metal Nexus for welcoming Dan and I so lovingly to the Metal Nexus family, and we are so humbled and encouraged by all of the outpour of support. Now we just have to create content that lives up to the hype, and that's kind of like another reason why we wanted to do this, just to kind of give you an idea of where we came from and what we hope to continue to keep doing in this new year. And if you would also like to keep up with Metal Nexus, you can find them at metalnexus.net. It is the home, the official home for the BREWtally Speaking podcast. You can listen to us now on Spotify. That is something new that we did, that we really wanted to do for this year too, is get on Spotify, have another avenue for everyone to listen to the podcast. So we are basically available everywhere you can listen to podcasts. iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox. Like, if it is a YouTube, if it is a place you can listen to a podcast, we are there. So looking forward to a very successful year and capping off what has been a really successful year for us. And Dan, where can people follow you specifically?
Oh, well, you can follow me at Discuss Metal Dan on Twitter. You can follow me under Daniel Terry under Facebook, and you can find my other podcast, Discography Discussion, at discussmetal.com.
And if you would like to keep up with me, pretty much I made it to where Dan and I are tagged on the podcast social, so just click that, find me if you want to. You're going to find basically records and whatever else I like. So with all of that, I'm going to try to do away with the songs that we used to play at the end of the thing. So we're going to play it to a song that I remembered that I think is very fitting for this podcast. So I found a song. It was off of It Dies Today's Lividity record. It was a bonus hidden track at the very end of the record. It's called Thanks for Drinking. It's a different take on the song that you probably would find if you search for that song. But I couldn't think of a more apropos end to this podcast now, as BREWtally Speaking. So we're going to end to that. And a quick shout out to Maruso over at the Bean Bastard. They are our sponsor of the podcast. Head over to thebeanbastard.com, pick you up some delicious coffee. Go over to Twitter and Instagram, simply the Bean Bastard. Let them know that the BREWtally Speaking podcast sent you, and we would greatly appreciate it. Again, like all of our socials, keep up, rate, review, subscribe. We're going to hammer that on all the other episodes we do from here on out. Thank you again, and to 2019, we are looking forward to entertaining you with a wide array of guests that we have lined up. So, for the BREWtally Speaking podcast, I'm John.
And I'm Dan.
Have a week.
Here we go! We've had the pint or 10 tonight. These cunts have all got me right. Glenn McGregor, what could be fucking better than a shot of fucking scotch on my watch? Thank you for drinking with me. Thank you for thinking it's free. Now it's time for a piper solo. Tommy, hit it! That's what I'm talking about. I'm feeling the fate coming on, my fellow. I'll lift my fucking kilt to say hello. Thank you for drinking with me. Thank you for thinking it's free. Thank you for drinking. drinking with me. Thank you for thinking this way. Seems like it's a good time to fucking smash someone in the face with a bottle or something. Look at your face, will you?